The New Zealand Defence Force consists of three services: the New Zealand Army, the Royal New Zealand Air Force, and the Royal New Zealand Navy, and is commanded and headed by the Chief of Defence Force. As of 2016, the Commander-in-Chief of the NZDF was Sir Jerry Mateparae, Governor-General of New Zealand, who exercised power on the advice of the Minister of Defence, Gerry Brownlee, under the Defence Act 1990. The Chief of Defence Force is Lieutenant-General Tim Keating, who previously served in the capacity of Vice Chief of Defence Force, having been appointed to his current position on the 31st of January 2014. Gerry Brownlee was appointed Minister of Defence as part of a cabinet reshuffle, following the 2014 New Zealand general election, replacing the now Minister of Health, Jonathan Coleman. New Zealand's armed forces have three defence policy objectives: to defend New Zealand against low-level threats, to contribute to regional security, and to play a part in global security efforts. New Zealand considers its own national defence needs to be modest due to its geographical isolation and benign relationships with neighbours. As of December 2015-167, NZDF personnel are deployed overseas on operations and UN missions in the South Pacific, Asia, Africa, Antarctica and Middle East areas, and over 200 on other overseas engagements or exercises. History of the Armed Services. Militia. After the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, New Zealand's security was dependent on British Imperial troops deployed from Australia and other parts of the Empire. By 1841, the settlers, particularly those in the New Zealand Company settlement of Wellington, were calling for local militia to be formed. In 1843, a local militia had been formed in Wellington without official sanction. This prompted the Chief Police Magistrate Major Matthew Richmond to order its immediate disbandment. Richmond also dispatched 53 soldiers from the 96th Regiment from Auckland to Wellington. These calls for a militia continued to grow with the Wairau fray. The calls eventually lead to a bill being introduced to the Legislative Assembly in 1844. Those present noted the disapproval of the bill, unanimously deferring it for 6 months. On the 22nd of March 1845, the Flagstaff War broke out, which proved to be the catalyst for passing the bill. In 1844, a select committee of the House of Commons had recommended that a militia, composed of both settlers and native Maori, and a permanent native force be set up. On the 25th of March 1845, the Militia Ordinance was passed into law. 26 officers were appointed in Auckland, thereby forming the start of New Zealand's own defence force. Major Richmond was appointed commander of the Wellington Battalion of the militia. Curiously, the newspaper article of the time notes that Wellington had a mounted volunteer corps. The Nelson Militia were formed about the end of May. In June 1845, 75 members of the Auckland Militia under Lieutenant Figg became the first unit to support British Imperial troops in the Flagstaff War, serving as pioneers. 7 militia were wounded in action between the 30th of June and the 1st of July 1845. A man named Riley, later died of his wounds. The Auckland Militia was disbanded in August or early September 1845 because of budgetary constraints. Disbandment of the Nelson and Wellington militias followed, much to the dismay of the supporters. Those at Nelson under Captain Greenwood decided, regardless of pay, not to continue training. Trouble in the Hutt Valley, near Wellington. Early March 1846 prompted the new Lieutenant Governor George Grey to proclaim martial law and call out the Hutt militia. Following on from this, the local paper noted that the No. 1 Company of the Wellington Militia had been called out, while the troops stationed in the town had been in the Hutt. The paper further noted that Grey intended to maintain 2 companies of militia in Wellington. As problems continued in the area, at least 160 militia remained. These were supplemented by volunteers and Maori warriors from the Te Aropa. On the 28th of October 1846, with the passing of the Armed Constabulary Ordinance in 1846, a fresh call was made by Mr. Donnelly of the legislature to do away with the militia because of its expense. However, the cost to Britain of maintaining a military force in New Zealand was considerable, prompting a dispatch on the 24th of November 1846 from Right Hon. Earl Grey to advise Lieutenant Governor George Grey that the formation of a well-organized militia and of a force of natives in the service of Her Majesty would appear to be the measures most likely to be successfully adopted. Further pressure in the early 1850s from Britain for removing the forces prompted pleas for them to remain, as the militia were deemed insufficient for the purpose. 1854 brought a new threat to the attention of the colony, because up to the time the military focus had been upon internal conflicts between settlers and the native population. War had broken out between Russia and Turkey. This war began to involve the major European powers and exposed New Zealand and Australia to a possible external threat from Russian naval forces. Parliament discussed providing guns at ports around the country for use in the event of a war with a foreign power. By 1858, attention had swung back to local issues, with a land dispute in New Plymouth prompting Governor Thomas Gore Brown to call out its militia under Captain Charles Brown, a prelude to what was to become the First Taranaki War and a period of conflict in the North Island until 1872. Parliament revised and expanded the Militia Ordinance, replacing it with the Militia Act 1858. Some of the main changes were clauses enabling volunteers to be included under such terms and conditions as the governor may specify. The Act also outlined the purposes under which militia could be called upon, including invasion. Debates in Parliament had included expressions of concern about Russian naval expansion in the Northern Pacific, pointed out that the sole naval defense consisted of one 24-gun frigate, and the time it would take for Britain to come to the colony's aid. British Imperial troops remained in New Zealand until February 1870, during the latest stage of the New Zealand Wars, by which time settler units had replaced them. The Defence Act 1886 reclassified the militia as volunteers. These were the forerunners of the territorials. The volunteers, although there were informal volunteer units as early as 1845, the appropriate approval and regulation of the units did not occur until the Militia Act 1858. Those who signed up for these units were exempt from militia duty, but had to be prepared to serve anywhere in New Zealand. One of the earliest gazetted units was the Taranaki Volunteer Rifle Company. To the Volunteer Rifle Corps were added Volunteer Artillery Corps in mid-1859. The first of these volunteer artillery corps were based in Auckland. By late 1859, the number of volunteer units were so great that Captain H.C. Balnavis was appointed Deputy Adjutant General based at Auckland. Colonial Defence Force. In 1863, the government passed the Colonial Defence Force Act 1862, creating the first regular force. This was to be a mounted body of not more than 500 troops, with both Maori and settlers, and costing no more than £30,000 per annum. All were volunteers and expected to serve for 3 years. Formation of the first unit did not commence until early April 1863, with 100 men being sought at New Plymouth under Captain Atkinson. Hawke's Bay was to have the next unit. By late April, papers were reporting few had enlisted in New Plymouth. Formation of an Auckland unit under Colonel Nixon commenced in July, and by the 14th had 30 men. Commander Major General Galloway. By October 1863 there was no Wairarapa-based defence force, and 50 were based in Wanganui. The Otago force had earlier been moved to Wellington, with further Otago volunteers heading for the Auckland and Hawke's Bay units. The total defence force numbered 375 by the 3rd of November 1863. In October 1864 the government decided to reduce the numbers in the Colonial Defence Force to 75, with 3 units of 25 members each in Wellington, Hawke's Bay and Taranaki. By this time there were about 10,000 British Imperial troops in New Zealand, supplemented by about as many New Zealand volunteer and militia forces. There were calls, particularly from South Island papers, for the British Imperial troops to be replaced by local forces. Parliamentary debates in late 1864 also supported this view, especially as the cost of maintaining the Imperial troops was becoming a greater financial burden on the colony. At the request of the governor in January 1865, a formal statement on the defence of the colony was presented on the 20th of March 1865. This proposed an armed constabulary force supported by friendly natives, the volunteer units, and militia as the case may require be established to take the place of the Imperial troops. The proposed force was to consist of 1,350 Europeans and 150 Maori, 1,500 in total. They were to be divided into 30 companies of 50 men each, based as follows. The total defence budget, which included purchasing a steamer for use on the Waikato, Pate, and Wanganui rivers, was £187,000 per annum. The budget's focus was solely on internal conflict. The issue of external conflict did not begin to resurface until the following year, with thought being given again to coastal defences. The Colonial Defence Force was disbanded in October 1867 by the Armed Constabulary Act 1867. Its members transferred to the Armed Constabulary. Evolution of volunteers and militia. From 1863 to 1867, Forest Ranger volunteer units were formed, tasked with searching out Maori war parties, acting as scouts, and protecting lines of communication. They arose out of the need to prevent ambushes and random attacks on civilians near forest areas. The Rangers were well armed and more highly paid. These units used guerrilla-style tactics, moving through areas under cover of darkness and ambushing war parties. The Forest Rangers were disbanded on the 1st of October 1867. See New Zealand Police. Alongside the militia and the British Imperial Forces were the Armed Constabulary. The Armed Constabulary were formed in 1846 with the passage of the Armed Constabulary Ordinance. The constabulary's role was both regular law enforcement and, during the New Zealand Wars, militia support. From 1867 to 1886, the Armed Constabulary were the only permanent force in New Zealand. The Defence Act 1909 replaced the volunteer forces with a territorial force and compulsory military training, a regime that remained until the late 1960s, with breaks from 1918 to 1921, 1930 to 194, and 194 to 1948. Separate services. See New Zealand Army, Royal New Zealand Air Force, and Royal New Zealand Navy. Independent New Zealand Armed Forces developed in the early 20th century. The Royal New Zealand Navy was the last to emerge as an independent service in 1941. Prior to the time it had been the New Zealand Division of the Royal Navy. New Zealand forces served alongside the British and other Empire and Commonwealth nations in World War I and World War II. The fall of Singapore in 1942 showed that Britain could no longer protect its far-flung dominions. Closer military ties were therefore necessary for New Zealand's defence. With the United States entering the war, they were an obvious choice. Links with Australia had also been developed earlier. Both nations sent troops to the Anglo-Boer War, and New Zealand officer candidates are trained at Australia's Royal Military College. Done true since 1911, a practice that continues to this day. A combined Australian and New Zealand Army Corps was formed for the Gallipoli campaign during World War I, and its exploits are key events in the military history of both countries. The Nzdf came into existence under the Defence Act 1990. Under previous legislation, the three services were part of the Ministry of Defence. Post 1990, the Ministry of Defence is a separate, policy-making body under a Secretary of Defence, equal in status to the Chief of Defence Force. Higher direction of the armed services. A new HQ Nzdf facility was opened by Prime Minister Helen Clark in March 2007. The new facility on Aitken Street in the Wellington CBD replaced the premises on Stout Street that had been the headquarters of Nzdf for nearly 75 years. The Aitken Street facility is home to around 900 employees of the Nzdf, the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service and the New Zealand Ministry of Defence. HQ Nzdf operates as the administrative and support headquarters for the New Zealand Defence Force, with operational forces under the separate administrative command and control of HQ JFNZ. Joint Forces Headquarters. The operational forces of the three services are directed from Headquarters Joint Forces New Zealand opposite Trentham Military Camp in Upper Hutt. HQ JFNZ was established at Trentham on 1 July 2001. For this building, a former NZ government computer centre that used to house the Army's Land Command, the Air Component Commander, Maritime Component Commander, and Land Component Commander exercise command over the forces. Commander Joint Forces New Zealand controls all overseas operational deployments and most overseas exercises. Senior officers. As of 2016, the Defence Force created a joint service corporate services organisation known as the Joint Logistics and Support Organisation in the 2000s, which later became Defence Shared Services. Following the establishment of Special Operations Command on 1 July 2015, the new position of Special Operations Component Commander was created. This officer reports to the Commander Joint Forces New Zealand, and is of equivalent status to the Maritime, Land and Air Component Commanders. Branches. Our Army. New Zealand's Army has 4,584 full-time and 1,671 part-time troops, organised as light infantry and motorised infantry equipped with 102 Canadian-manufactured LAV-3 light armoured vehicles. There are also armoured reconnaissance, artillery, logistic communications, medical and intelligence elements. The New Zealand Special Air Service is the Nzdf Special Forces capability, which operates in both conventional warfare and counter-terrorist roles. The corps and regiments of the New Zealand Army include Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment, Royal New Zealand Armoured Corps, Royal Regiment of New Zealand Artillery, Corps of Royal New Zealand Engineers, Royal New Zealand Corps of Signals, Royal New Zealand Army Logistic Regiment, Royal New Zealand Army Medical Corps, Royal New Zealand Army Nursing Corps, Royal New Zealand Army Dental Corps, Corps of Royal New Zealand Military Police. New Zealand Intelligence Corps, New Zealand Army Legal Services, Navy. The Royal New Zealand Navy has 2,132 full-time and 435 part-time sailors. The RNZN possess two Anzac-class frigates, developed in conjunction with Australia, based on the German MEKO 200 design. 8 other vessels are in use, consisting of patrol vessels and logistics vessels. In 2010, the RNZN completed the acquisition of 7 new vessels, 1 large multi-role vessel named the Nzdf Canterbury, 2 offshore patrol vessels, and 4 inshore patrol vessels. All of these vessels were acquired under Project Protector, and were built to commercial, not naval, standards. Air Force. The Royal New Zealand Air Force has 2,403 full-time and 212 part-time airmen and airwomen. The RNZAF consists of 51 aircraft, consisting of P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft and Lockheed C-130 Hercules and other transport aircraft. The Industries NH-90 operates in a medium utility role, and the Auguste Westland AW-109 operates the light utility helicopter role. In addition to the main training platform, RNZAF primary flight training occurs in Beechcraft T-6 Texan IIs before moving on to the Beechcraft King Air. The RNZAF does not have air combat capabilities following the retirement without replacement of its air combat force of A4 Skyhawks in December 2001. The RNZAF maintains some form of minor strike capability, with the P-3 Orion being able to drop small, unguided bombs. Foreign defense relations. New Zealand states it maintains a credible minimum force, although critics maintain that the country's defense forces have fallen below this standard, with a claimed area of direct strategic concern that extends from Australia to Southeast Asia to the South Pacific, and with defense expenditures that total around 1% of GDP. New Zealand necessarily places substantial reliance on cooperating with other countries, particularly Australia, acknowledging the need to improve its defense capabilities. The government in 2005 announced the Defense Sustainability Initiative, allocating an additional $4.6 billion over 10 years to modernize the country's defense equipment and infrastructure and increase its military personnel. The funding represented a 51% increase in defense spending since the Labour government took office in 1999. New Zealand is an active participant in multilateral peacekeeping. It has taken a leading role in peacekeeping in the Solomon Islands and the neighbouring island of Bougainville. New Zealand has contributed to United Nations and other peacekeeping operations in Angola, Cambodia, Somalia, Lebanon and the former Yugoslavia. It also participated in the Multilateral Interception Force in the Persian Gulf. New Zealand has an ongoing peacekeeping commitment to East Timor, where it participated in the INTERFET, UNTAT and UMAMET missions from 1999 to 2002. At one point over 1,000 Nzdf personnel were in East Timor. The deployment included the vessels HMNZS Canterbury, Taikaha and Endeavour, 6 Iroquois helicopters, 2 C-130 Hercules and an infantry battalion. In response to renewed conflict in 2006, more troops were deployed as part of an international force. New Zealand has participated in 2 NATO-led coalitions, SFOR in the former Yugoslavia and an ongoing one in Afghanistan. New Zealand also participated in the European Union EUFOR operation in the former Yugoslavia from December 2004 until New Zealand ended its 15-year continuous contribution there on the 30th of June 2007. As of December 2015, New Zealand has 167 personnel deployed across the globe. These deployments are to Afghanistan, Antarctica, South Korea, Iraq, Middle East, Sinai, South Sudan and the United Arab Emirates. 209 Nzdf personnel are on other deployments and exercises. New Zealand shares training facilities, personnel exchanges, and joint exercises with the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Brunei, Tonga, and South Pacific states. It exercises with its 5 power defence arrangements partners: Australia, the United Kingdom, Malaysia, and Singapore. New Zealand military personnel participate in training exercises, conferences and visits as part of military diplomacy. New Zealand is a signatory of the ANZ-US Treaty, a defence pact between New Zealand, Australia and the United States, dating from 1951. After the 1986 anti-nuclear legislation that refused access of nuclear-powered or armed vessels to ports, the USA withdrew its obligations to New Zealand under ANZ-US, and ANZ-US exercises are now bilateral between Australia and the United States. Under anti-nuclear legislation, any ship must declare whether it is nuclear-propelled or carrying nuclear weapons before entering New Zealand waters. Due to the U.S. policy at the time of neither confirm nor deny, ship visits ceased, although NZ and the USA remained good friends. Despite the presidential directive of the 27th of September 1991 that removed tactical nuclear weapons from U.S. surface ships, attack submarines, and naval aircraft, ship visits have not resumed. Despite signs of rapprochement in recent years, military relationships with the U.S. remain limited. The Nzdf served alongside NATO-led forces in Afghanistan in the first decade of the 21st century, and in 2004 the NZSAS was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation by U.S. President George W. Bush for extraordinary heroism in action. In 2008, U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, during a visit to New Zealand, said, "New Zealand is now a friend and an ally. New Zealand is a member of the ABCA Army's Standardization Program, the Naval AUSCAN-NZ-UK-US Forum, the Air and Space Interoperability Council and other Western 5 eyes for sharing signals, intelligence information and achieving interoperability with like-minded armed forces, such as the Technical Cooperation Program."